You're listening to Blockchain 2025. The future is right now. Every week, we explore implications of the technology underpinning cryptocurrencies. Blockchain.
Each episode is a standalone examination of one industry broken into 3 segments: a basic overview, blockchain's disruptive impact, and relevant crypto projects.
Blockchain 2025 is part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Learn about Bitcoin, create a wallet, and buy your first Satoshis all at Bitcoin.com.
All right, Kelso, how's it going, man?
Excellent, man. How are you?
Doing good, man. You know, the Bitcoin world does not slow down.
Never.
But overall, feeling pretty good, man.
Yeah, same here. Same here.
Cool.
I'm really excited for the show today. I like that you snagged this interview. This is kind of a big deal. It's one of those quiet subjects that sort of sneaks up on you, but it definitely affects everybody.
For sure, man. Let's go right into the show. I mean, Jared from DigiByte, who came on for our special episode, he's the guy that like the government of Hong Kong, China, United States, logistics companies talk to. And he's the foremost expert. And he talked about supply chain a little bit for a couple of minutes in our special. And, you know, food's close to my heart. Mm-hmm. And Ambrosus, which had some backing from Gavin Wood at one point. I'm not sure if they still do. They might. But they're like a 20, 30 person company already. And they're working with food and pharmaceutical companies to help trace them on the international supply chain.
Yeah, I was sort of shocked by how antiquated it is, according to your guest here, which he'll get into. But it's sort of fascinating how something like technology in this instance could just radically change how we eat and how we get medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made a lot of good points. Again, it's early. They seem to be making a lot of headway, but I do think that you're getting buy-in from the right people is important. And maybe that will be, I'd like to say us doing this show, getting the awareness out about the importance and the benefits of blockchain technology. But if we can contribute to the demand by consumers for traceability and wanting to know where things come from and guaranteeing authenticity of pharmaceutical drugs or the food came from and what condition it's been in, I mean, I think that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's increasingly important. Where I live here in Southern California, very health conscious people really want to know where their food comes from, where their poultry and produce and everything else comes from. It's very important to them. If you as a company can document that with any kind of confidence to the consumer, I think you're going to be rewarded.
And Kelsey, let me ask you, man, does it bother you a little bit, the kind of crunchy people going to the health food restaurants? Where was this sourced from? Southern California vibe?
It can get a little obnoxious. I'm one of these guys that if you put food in front of me, it will disappear. I'm not exactly the most health conscious fellow on the planet. But yeah, in a perverse way, I mean, obviously it's annoying, as hippies tend to be. But I've learned a lot, sourcing my food, where it comes from, how it's made, how that plate gets assembled. So there's room for it. I've come to learn these lovable socialists, these lovable statists. I've come to kind of respect where they're coming from.
For sure, man. And the natural foods industry, I just think a huge marketing thing going forward with blockchain is being able to see exactly, where your coffee was grown, et cetera, the point in Kenya or Ethiopia or Colombia that it came from. I just think just the interaction,
yeah.
And we'll talk about this in sports, but just fans of entertainment, of food products, they want to know where it's coming from. So I think that's another factor as well.
Yeah, I enjoy that aspect of it. Starbucks is sort of ubiquitous and kind of became famous for this without really trying. And you could see where your coffee beans came from, your stupid Danish, whatever it is that you're getting there, your water, all that stuff. So I definitely think there's a place for it. And as going forward, more consumers, especially as millennials, I guess, what are you guys now? You're in late 20s, maybe 30s. Let's start to have kids. They really, they're very, 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 very concerned about where the stuff is coming from.
For sure, man. Well, hey, without further ado, let's play this interview. Thanks again to Angel and the Ambrosus team and Anna as well, their PR girl, for helping put this show together.
Okay.
Angel Versetti, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you.
And listen, Angel, I think that just like any industry, there's so many global industries that if you're not in it, you don't really realize everything that's going on. And supply chain has a lot of archaic things going on. I work in food personally, so I know quite a bit about organic produce and the certifications and all the manual FedExing documents for containers, things that just aren't done digitally that cost time and money each time. But I'd like you having, a business working to take it to the next level, we'll say. What's the current state of sending food and the supply chain?
Yeah, so as you rightly pointed out, it's very archaic. So a lot of processes are simply done based on paperwork. It's pretty siloed, so there are kind of different parts of the supply chain that are entirely disconnected from each other. So the data doesn't travel, the data isn't even captured in most cases. So besides what's necessary for compliance and basic business operations to track the products, that's, the minimum that's done. And it's simply when the different stakeholders in the supply chain pass the container or a product from one to another, they hand over the pile of documents, and everything that the consumer or other stakeholders in the supply chain might want to know in terms of the life cycle of the product, what happened to it, where it came from, and what the ingredients are, it's simply missing from this equation. And it's so because everything is based on paperwork, and all the kind of supply chain quality assurance techniques are, they're analog basically. They don't record the data that can be later on transmitted together with the product. And of course, what this leads to is high inefficiencies and also very big risks for operations and for quality of products. In the last 10 years, every single year has had more and more food scandals than the previous one. Either that's mislabeled products or items whose kind of point of departure is not clear because they can sometimes enter multiple ports, or otherwise where you don't really know, have proper data about the products that you're getting. And mislabeling, fraud, and other problems, they cause huge damage, both the socioeconomic, in terms of people whose health is affected and so on, and just the purely financial losses. So just in the US alone, I think last year, the damage from food scandals was around $55 billion. So that's just for one country. So worldwide, this number is about $300 billion. So it's a huge amount, obviously, resources wasted, inefficiencies that lead to these problems. But at the same time, we have on the other end of the planet, we have issues such as, lack of proper food and other problems. So basically, supply chains are broken. And right now, there are almost no incentives for companies to transform the way that they do business, although the consumers themselves are increasingly demanded something where they could, they wouldn't have to trust advertisement or promises or labels, but some kind of solution where they would be able to check for themselves, am I getting the real thing? Is that product actually exactly the same as the package is telling me, and what happened to it? So all these things are missing, and this is what creates an opportunity to enter the market.
For sure. And I want to focus a little bit more on the current situation. And you did a good job overviewing. $55 billion in loss. And that can be, like you mentioned, fraud. We've seen it a lot with organic ingredients being mislabeled. The point of origin. How do you really know about the point of origin? Still, there has to be a lot of trust. It's very easy to forge certificates. Angel, I've seen it in my industry in organic fruit and produce where people claim that their dried fruit is organic, but what they do is the time of inspection, they'll go to one farm, but as soon as the inspector leaves for the rest of the year, they'll buy fruit from a different point of origin and use non-organic fruit and sell it as organic, which is a huge contribution to fraud. And I know that Ambrosus is also working in pharmaceuticals. And you paint the picture with analog, all this document, people sending, reviewing documents, information is siloed, meaning that if you want to trace food, it's quite difficult because you might have to talk to, 5 or 7 different departments and agencies around the world and get them to give this information. And so investigation is quite difficult. But I'm not so familiar with pharmaceuticals. What are some of the challenges right now in the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to supply chain?
Yes, so there are quite a few similarities between food and pharmaceutical supply chains. So the issues I've described earlier are equally applicable to the pharma industry. But the pharma industry on top of that has, of course, more complications. The first one is the fact that it's even heavier regulated than the food one. So there are a lot of stipulations, rules, and so on, because ultimately, of course, medicine is what directly impacts health and life of people, although I would argue that food is the same, only maybe it's not as obvious.
Agreed.
From that perspective, there are a lot more compliance pushes for the companies to to change their behavior and operations. So, for instance, one of the pharma companies we were talking with, they actually told us that, and I'm talking about one of the largest companies in the world, and they told us only last year did we switch to the cloud finally, because we got all the approvals from the different regulators and stakeholders. So it takes them many years to align everybody and to upgrade their systems and to get everybody's approval and basically agreement to use the system. So from that perspective, of course, and it costs them huge amounts of money. So they spend a lot of money on compliance and on making sure that everything is proper, because they're not so much worried about obviously the quality itself, but they're worried about potential lawsuits, consequences, and governmental sanctions against them. So from that perspective, the industry is very conservative, and they, as long as things work, even if it's inefficient and even if it's a lot of paperwork and hassle, they're usually going to stick with it. So what I'm observing is that in the food sector, companies are more open to experimentation with new technologies. Why? Because they can actually position it to their end consumers. They can use a blockchain-based solution, for example, as a marketing tool for their end consumers, and to say in a supermarket, hey, buy this product, you can check it, and so on. Whereas for the pharma companies, that's currently not the case. So what they see an opportunity in is maybe improving their internal supply chain management processes, reducing costs or friction, or improving payment settlements within the company. So from that perspective, the pain points of the pharma supply chains and the possible solutions for them are quite different from the food industry.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so the supply chain for food differs quite a bit from pharmaceuticals in a lot of places, right? Like the point of origin, a lot of times you have the farms, then you have the packing plants sending out, whereas with pharmaceuticals, you might just have one laboratory that does everything in-house. And then obviously on the point of sale, or you have the importer, you have distributors, but it's much more controlled with pharmaceuticals. And so that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, you're in a very interesting space because there's so many stakeholders. I mean, we mentioned the suppliers, the manufacturers, we mentioned the end consumers, but there's also the regulatory agencies, both on the export and import side. There's also the shipping companies. I mean, logistics, right? That's another gigantic industry in itself. Do you see any, in terms of the regulatory agencies and the shipping companies, do you see where blockchain could potentially add value there?
Yeah, so I would say there are multiple hotspots where the problems are particularly severe or the opportunities are particularly obvious, where one could start experimenting with blockchain. And this is in fact what we've been doing. So we've been, the supply chain is obviously big and complex and has many stakeholders, but you can pick a particular part of it and you focus on that part. So to give an example from the pharmaceutical sector, very often, especially in Europe, the conditions for preparation and processing of medicine are very well maintained, but where more problems exist is in the distribution stage. And the pharmacies are also relatively well managed. So, you have a well-managed factory and a well-managed pharmacy, but in between, for the distribution stages and warehouses, this is where currently there are a lot of kind of black spots in terms of information about, the temperature of storage, humidity, sunlight exposure, or any other influencers on the quality of product. So from that perspective, there is, not enough data, and usually companies select the distributors based on how well they are supposedly performing in terms of quality assessment and so on. But there is a very clear opportunity, and the intermediaries are obviously, it's not in their interest to report if there are any problems, because then they're liable for damages, or they have to claim insurance, or they're otherwise responsible. So here they are pretty incentivized to actually manipulate with data and possibly change it to hide any problems. And very often it's, when we're talking about shipments worth millions of dollars or sometimes billions of dollars, then the stakes are pretty high. So even if they do face some potential backlash for that, or possibly some kind of sanctions, legally speaking, the sanctions are usually much lower than the potential winnings that they're making. So it's worth it for them. So from that perspective, blockchain can be, let's say, like a public notary, if you want, for that kind of data to assure the life, the different life stages of the products. In other cases, it can be actually improving, as I mentioned, boosting the sales and marketing, so engaging the consumer, where it's not so much the technology itself, but the perception of the consumers about that technology. So if right now, especially with the new generation, with millennials, they are pretty cynical, they don't trust classical advertisement and standard marketing techniques, the way that products, especially in the food sector, are marketed nowadays is quite different. So from that perspective, a lot of more people care about sustainability, ethics, fair trade. So that's why all these labels have been quite prominent in the last few years. But people want more proof. They want to better connect with, people who are producing their food, or they want to see how exactly is this product better? How does it improve the livelihoods of farmers, or how is it more environmentally friendly? They don't want just to see the label. They want to be able to verify it through some kind of trusted technology. So from that perspective, it opens possibility for these companies to engage their consumers and to reinvent themselves. So I would say these two are, for me, kind of the two most obvious use cases in supply chain where blockchain currently makes sense. But in the future, there'll be more and more such use cases.
For sure. And I just want to define something for listeners, because we're going to talk about Ambrosus in a second, but Internet of Things are basically sensors and smart devices that are connected to the internet, and this information is shared via a blockchain. So the whole idea is it's combining blockchain with Internet of Things, these data sensors, to be able to track whether it's food products or pharmaceutical drugs from the point of origin to the final customer. And so I want to go back on a couple things you said, Angel, because they're pretty interesting. One is, you mentioned with pharmaceuticals, you could have a very solid pharmaceutical company, maybe they make a headache medicine, for example, and then you have a pharmacy that also has very good control on temperature and their cleanliness and inventory, et cetera, et cetera. But in between, you have these black spots, the distributors. So the bad things that can happen there are, like you mentioned, one is, the air conditioning goes out and the temperature is not consistent, or in the truck, or maybe they mislabel things, or et cetera, et cetera. And you also mentioned incentives. So for these types of processes, right, you need a lot of buy-in. So basically, if a pharmaceutical company wants to start working with Ambrosus, they'd also have to convince their distributors and say, hey, we want you to use these sensors. Or would the pharmaceutical company, because they put these smart sensors on the devices and are using blockchain, the distribution company, I'm assuming they don't mess with the sensors, is just going to be forced into sharing this information, adding transparency to the supply chain?
Yeah, so in terms of the companies, the distributing companies, so the first thing is a lot of them offer very similar services to the pharmaceutical companies. So they're almost treated as commodities, because most of them, the value proposition is nearly the same. And especially in Europe and also in Asia, actually, there are quite a lot of companies that are underutilized in the kind of overall shipping industry and distribution. So from that perspective, each of them is trying to differentiate. Usually they are differentiating themselves by quality, and for example, if they also include the cold chain and so on, so any additional services that they offer. But many of them are looking for additional differentiators, so it's not that difficult to get a buy-in from them. Secondly, we do not require them to install something different. What we only require is the ability to connect. So as long as they have some sort of connectivity, whether that's the truck that can upload the data at some point, or if it's the sensors that might have some kind of connectivity, either Bluetooth or maybe they're connected through 3G, but simply the ability to supply data. So that already makes the kind of barriers a lot lower, because we don't ask them to change any of their hardware. We're simply providing them the protocols to provide the data to the platform, and then the other stakeholders can make use of it. Another part that you mentioned is about data sharing in general, and that's the concern for many companies. As a matter of fact, I would say that most companies we're dealing with, unless they want to use it for marketing, obviously, unless that's that particular case, they don't actually want to make the data public at all. I suspect because a lot of them are not doing things in the nicest way. That's why they don't want to make it too obvious, but they also have obviously some other reasons or excuses. It's hard for me to judge which one is which, but they say, for instance, we don't want our competitors to know where we're sourcing our products from and some other information. But from that perspective, you may have possibilities where they always own the data. They don't have to send it anywhere, and they simply provide the metadata for the blockchain. And what it gives to them is, it gives them the opportunity to verify if at any later point point there is any investigation, a product recall, or any other problem where there is a suspicion that the data might have been changed or manipulated, they can always refer to the metadata, to the hashes recorded on the blockchain, and verify and compare it with the original data that only they hold, and they can prove to the governments, or if necessary to the consumers, that, hey guys, look, we're honest. So these are the potential benefits, and these are also the reasons why they might get a buy-in much quicker, because it's in their own interest. And even though they say, we don't want our competitors to know that we're doing this, their competitors are saying the same. So there is a bit of a game going on here where everybody's waiting for somebody else to run ahead and say, oh, we've adopted this. So everybody's currently testing out and checking how they like it and how others are perceiving it. But it seems that there is already, the benefits of blockchain are already widely recognized also within those industries, and they're just trying to see which company can build them the most suitable solution, because the benefits are very clear to them.
Very interesting. Let's go into Ambrosus, man. There's a couple questions I had, and on a high level, Ambrosus is taking the supply chain to the next level with blockchain and IoT, but there's a couple things that I'd like to fill in for listeners. And again, maybe we could give some concrete examples of, the ideal vision of, let's say, fruit or coffee or pharmaceutical drugs with Ambrosus, just to paint the picture for listeners. I'm going to ask you to do that. But also, the one thing that I wasn't quite sure is working on sensors in a lab. Will Ambrosus be producing special IoT sensors, or are they developing a network to connect with existing IoT sensors?
Yes, so I'll go ahead for the first part first and then the second. So the first part is, what is Ambrosus? Ambrosus is a platform that combines blockchain. Actually, I can talk a bit more about what kind of blockchain we have, because we've built and our unique architecture, but there is blockchain at the core. Next to it, there is a distributed storage platform. So what it does is that blockchain is processing transactions, but distributed storage obviously offers an opportunity to store large amounts of data that is too large for the blockchain itself. So these are the first two components. And the third component is the variety of protocols that we've built for sensors to talk to the blockchain. So it basically structures the data coming from the sensors, and we have the so-called data producers. So those are specific nodes with APIs to which sensors can connect and send the data. So in the end, we have three kinds of data processes within the system: data production collected from sensors, then data validation provided on the blockchain, and finally data processing and data storage that is currently stored on the distributed storage solution.
Okay, and I just want to make sure that my listeners don't get lost, and myself as well. So there's three main parts, right? You have the blockchain, right, which is a distributed ledger tracing these products and the supply chain. Then you have the sensor networks, which is basically taking the data using IoT sensors, collecting all this data and the inputs, right, and then organizing it in what you called distributed storage. So this is just all of the data, all of the temperature logging data, points of origin, et cetera, et cetera. It's too much information to store on the blockchain, but that will be stored on distributed storage networks by Ambrosus. Did I get that right?
By Ambrosus and the broader community. So we have a peer-to-peer storage system where people are incentivized to provide storage for data.
Gotcha.
What you said at the beginning, so the blockchain itself is not responsible for specifically tracking things in the supply chain. So the blockchain we have is basically a smart contract-powered general-purpose blockchain. But what we have created is two kinds of transactions specifically for supply chains. One of them is called assets, and another one is called events. So the asset transaction, as the name suggests, it pertains to creation of a digital identifier for the product on the blockchain. So the moment a pack of medicine is produced or a container is shipped, so any object that whose history begins, you have the asset being created on the blockchain. And then following that, there are the transactions that are called events. And an event is any sensor-generated information about the product. Temperature, location, storage, ingredients, chemical analysis. It can be anything. Importantly, it's some kind of data about the quality of the product that is attached to a particular digital asset. So in the end, the recipient gets the product and the digital history of the product on the blockchain.
Gotcha. Okay, so let me spit back an example to make sure that I understood it correctly, right? So let's just say we're a pharmaceutical factory in the Dominican Republic, right? And we're creating some type of headache medicine, some type of aspirin. So basically there'll be sensors in the laboratory where it's produced. So as soon as the unit is produced, right? Sensors on the pallet or somewhere on a case will say, okay, timestamp at this time, this product with identifying code, whatever, was produced, right? And then you mentioned events, then maybe it's shipped on a container to Amsterdam, to the port of Amsterdam. And then it will say, okay, from X date to Y date, these events, it was on this, shipping boat at these locations, right? These are all the events and the temperatures between X and Y, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of building this history of this product. And then the final consumer, maybe they buy this aspirin and they might want to scan it because, a lot of times products expire and maybe they don't take the aspirin out for another year. And they're like, okay, well, where did this product come from? They'll be able to scan it and look, okay, it was actually created in the Dominican Republic on X date. If you really want to go into it, you can see the whole history of the product. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And is there any danger with competitors? Because are these public blockchains?
So about the data, as I've told you, on our side, we have a flexible option. What this means is that if the company is interested to use this public, to make this data public to begin with, they can provide this information on the distributed storage so that the full information is available to the customers. If, however, they want to keep the data private, but they do want to keep a public ledger for the record, maybe for governmental compliance or for any other, maybe they have a partnership with the quality assurance companies. So we work with a couple of quality assurance companies right now, and they have long-standing agreements with various companies to assure the quality of their products. So in this case, they can only share the data with the quality assurance company. So they don't make it public, but they do share it with the quality assurance company, and then they get the certification, and the quality assurance company can verify without sending a bunch of human inspectors that yes, the data is right and we are satisfied. So from that perspective, it's up to them to decide what they need. But importantly, the data itself, they don't have to make everything public. And I'll give you one example where it makes perfect sense for them to do that is in the case of a recall. So recalls are obviously a very painful and very expensive problem for a lot of companies. And usually, because there is not enough information about the products and what products have been, let's say, contaminated, like if we're talking about the food supply chain, then the company has two painful choices if they discover that something is wrong. Either they have to do a total recall when they might potentially recall a lot of products that are still all right, but they will lose millions, potentially billions of dollars worth of products, or they could risk not recalling the product, but then what could happen is somebody dies or somebody has a sickness and the company may have a lot of problems or might have legal issues, and the damage to brand can be huge. And a lot of the biggest companies, especially in the food and pharma sector, the value of their brands is often in billions of dollars. They have spent a lot of money on marketing, advertisement, branding, and PR to build up the huge value in their brands. And every time there's a huge scandal, then their brand is damaged. So a lot of money is lost on that. So from that perspective, they themselves might be interested to do that to protect their financial assets. If we're talking about brand being an asset of their company. And blockchain is this trustless environment where they can verify vis-a-vis their other stakeholders if everything is fine or not, even if they do not actually share the data with the end consumer. So there's a great deal of flexibility that can be done on our blockchain. That's really interesting. And I think it will be interesting too. You mentioned the incentives and the pressure of competitors to become more transparent, especially like in distribution and things like that. But I also think, if one big food company offers full transparency where their customers can see everything on the distributed storage, that will incentivize other companies, their competitors, to be as transparent as possible, because the more transparent it gets, the more trust that the end consumer will rightly have. And Angel, finishing up here, you have the AMB token. What is the use case of the Ambrosus token for all stakeholders involved? Yes, so the primary use of the token is that it actually is used to create these digital assets and events. So when you create a digital asset, you attach a certain amount of Amber to it, and then it becomes like a digital certificate traveling with the product. And as it records additional events, this is the information that is populated within that certificate. So it serves as the building block for the certificate. On top of that, tokens are also directly used we have the blockchain that I mentioned and distributed storage. So there are several levels of nodes that can participate in the platform and provide different services to it. So for example, some users might provide storage, peer-to-peer storage, And in that case, the token is used to incentivize the data providers to have availability of data. So they both use the token as a stake in their node, and they also use it to incentivize other stakeholders to provide data accessibility. So it becomes basically a utility token, and it's responsible for recording, processing, storing, and recalling of data.
Gotcha. So recording of data, storing data, an incentive for people to run nodes and store the data, as well as companies using this will use the Amber token, the AMB token, to pay for the sensor data and everything to be recorded, correct?
They pay to the network. That's correct, yes.
Very cool. Well, hey, Angel, very fascinating stuff. Huge opportunity in front of you. I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing the way blockchain could disrupt the archaic, as you mentioned, I think we both mentioned, the state of international supply chain and logistics.
Yep.
Yeah, man. And so, hey, Angel, we'll definitely be tracking Ambrosus. I wish you the best of luck. Do you have any milestones or any, I don't know, let's say a couple years down the road where you'd like the company to be?
So when you mentioned milestones, I thought about the immediate milestones we have. But if you're asking for longer term stuff, in general, well, the first thing, actually, you mentioned it a while ago, but I think having responded to the first part of that question, I did move to the second one. So the first milestone for the next couple of years is all these sensors. So you asked if we right now are dealing with producing sensors. We do not. Right now, we only create the network that can communicate with sensors en masse. But for the future, we are looking to create secure sensors, because one of the basic problems is the security. So how easily can you manipulate the data on the sensor? So this is the major part, what we hope to be able in 2 years to provide the sensors that could be of new levels of security that is currently unavailable. Second part is in 2 years, my hope is that there will be supply chains that can be fairly autonomous. So what I mean by that is not only can they be digitalized and have the data being recorded on a platform, whether that's blockchain based or simply some kind of digital platform, but also that using smart contracts, for example, that the processes could be automated. And we have already developed some use cases where you can create basic agreements that if the temperature of package has fallen by more than 5 degrees, so it's been outside of the range for more than 2 hours, reimburse the money immediately. So this is the simplest transaction you could make. So you could have entire commercial agreements running on the blockchain in the supply chain, and there could be fewer disputes because of that, because the data would be transparent, it would be clear to both parties, and you wouldn't have kind of lengthy months and years longs of processes to recover the money when there's any fraud or problem, because all the data would be there. And you could even have sensors serving as sort of a oracle, the source of truth for the information. So it would be interesting to see supply chains becoming more automated, and more broadly speaking, there are quite a few cities worldwide that want to be smart cities by 2020. So that's just a year and a half left until it's there. So what we are hoping to do is to be the solution for smart cities when it comes to the management of their supply chains and resource management. So that's my kind of objective for the next 2 years.
That's so interesting. I mean, whether, the food shows up rotten, et cetera, the coffee is stained or in not good condition, like you mentioned. I mean, this is a high percentage of cost of the food industry is like, whose fault is it in determining fault and also proving fault. You might know, I think it's a trucking company. But if you could, with these sensors, prove one step and say, hey, we can prove on our sensors that the warehouse in Oklahoma, the temperature went into the 90s for 3 days, and that's why it got damaged. Or even better, having a smart contract that says if temperature leaves this range, automatically pay X amount of money to the supplier or the end buyer, whoever is putting the cost initially. That's really cool, man. Well, again, Angel, thanks so much, man. And I wish you so much luck with Ambrosus and everything you guys are doing.
Thank you very much, Matt. And once again, thanks very much for inviting.
This is Roger Ver. Make sure to listen to the Humans of Bitcoin podcast, part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Stories from people around the world whose lives have been changed by Bitcoin. New episodes every Tuesday.
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin.com podcast network. To learn more about our shows, visit Bitcoin.com/podcast. Bitcoin.com podcast network.